Fox 5 and Hot 97 present Street Soldiers with Lisa Evers.
I'm so glad you're joining me for this episode of Street Soldiers on R.Kelly. For the last couple of years, R.Kelly's home has been a jail cell in the notorious Metropolitan Detention Center. He's been locked down without bail since being charged with federal sex trafficking, charges he denies. It's a spectacular fall from the heights of fame and fortune, and now he's fighting for his freedom. Multi-platinum Grammy-winning R&B superstar R. Kelly has spent many days of his trial sitting in between his lawyers in federal court, listening to his accusers testify to the shocking details of their experiences with him. Prosecutors say he is a sexual predator who used his network of managers, assistants, and bodyguards to transport women across state lines for sex. It's an unusual use of the RICO law that's been used against mobsters and drug cartels, says criminal defense attorney Philip Hamilton.
They have a strong case. They have a lot of witnesses. They have a lot of evidence that's in now to, support the underlying allegations that R. Kelly was running a criminal enterprise with the sole purpose of, trafficking women across state lines for the purposes of, sexual activity and crimes therein.
Early in the case, Kelly's defense team characterized the accusers as disgruntled groupies and insisted that any sex that happened was consensual. Multiple accusers testified he gave them an STD and that they were sexually and physically abused. It takes courage to speak out, says former sex crimes prosecutor Charles Tucker Jr.
It's high time that we stop victimizing the victims and making sure they're given and afforded the protections that the law allows and was intended to provide them.
R. Kelly's music career achievements cannot be denied. Many of the allegations against him happened at the height of his fame, when his influence was powerful and he was succeeding as a recording artist, live performer, music producer, and songwriter, says Nina Rouhani of Billboard.
Everything this man would touch would turn into gold, whether it was on a mainstream level with the Hot 100 or whether it was, just specifically R&B radio, R&B hip hop radio airplay, like all across the spectrum, right? Like he won 12 times at the Billboard Music Awards. He won 3 Grammys.
There's so many issues in this case. Let's break it down with our panel. Joining me, Nina Rouhani. She's a Billboard R&B hip hop reporter. Nina, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
We appreciate it. Also with us is Charles Tucker Jr. He's a criminal defense attorney and also a former sex crimes prosecutor. His firm is Tucker Moore Law Group, LLP. Charles, thanks so much for being with us. We appreciate it.
Pleasure to be here, Lisa. Thank you for having me.
Also joining us is Philip Hamilton. He's a criminal defense attorney and managing partner of Hamilton Clark, LLP. Phil, great to have you with us.
Lisa, thanks for having me as always.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Nina, you have been in court every single day, pretty much throughout this trial. Has anything surprised you? Because there are people who feel like we've heard everything we need to know about R. Kelly. Were there any things that surprised you?
I mean, I think there were a number of things that surprised me. I would definitely say the approach that the defense is taking has been really interesting to watch unfold. I know that there were some last minute sort of switch ups in his defense, and I would, attribute a little bit of that to the changes in his defense. So that's definitely been interesting to watch, kind of how they're angling this and the approach that they took during opening statements and sort of throughout their cross-examinations. Also, I mean, the allegations are just shocking. So it's like you can hear them a million times, but when you sit down in a courtroom and are hearing it, like that's not the same as reading it in somebody's book or watching a TMZ interview. Like these, prosecutors and the defense are going to critique every last detail. So that whatever it is that they're telling on that stand, there's a lot to back it up. And so hearing sort of those uncut narratives, it's been, shocking to say the least.
And I've been in court for Fox 5 News a number of days, and it's just we'll be taking notes like what is this person who's on the stand saying, and then all of a sudden you hear a word, and every single head in that reporters in the media overflow room is like, goes
right.
Like,
and we're in that room. So It's like we can react, whereas if you're in the courtroom, you can't. So you'll hear like audible reactions from reporters. And there was actually one day when they had the Kelly supporters in the room with the reporters.
I remember
which was super interesting to kind of hear them behind us and how they're reacting and kind of trying to see how it's crazy.
No, it's definitely crazy. Charles Tucker Jr., as a former sex crimes prosecutor, and you also were involved in a civil case with one of the accusers. What is this case really all about?
Well, I think it's a skilled way and probably pretty crafty way for a prosecutor to try to hold R. Kelly accountable for these sexual acts against these women. The Mann Act in itself, I mean, it's an old statute created back in 1910 for the purposes of preventing young women from being brought into prostitution and sex slavery. So it's a very interesting way that they've kind of crafted this. And, to Nina's point, to kind of see this all unfold, right, it's very interesting to say the least. But it's an attempt at the government to hold him accountable in a court of law and in front of a jury of his peers and to actually put on a case, a solid case that can actually withstand the standard, which is the highest standard that we know, which is beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's going to be a hard job to do.
Phil, what about from the defense point of view, from the charges? You've been up against these federal prosecutors. Break that down for us.
I mean, essentially, like Charles was saying, R. Kelly is facing, not just counts of the Mann Act, but most essentially a racketeering count, right? And with respect to racketeering,
what we call RICO, right?
Exactly. I was just about to say, you took the words out of my mouth, Lisa. It's a RICO conspiracy type of act. A lot of what you see, a lot of the hip hop guys ultimately charged with when they come in on the big federal indictments, that's essentially what they've charged R. Kelly with. And when Charles is ultimately saying that this is kind of like uniquely crafty on the government's behalf, it is in many respects, because we're so used to and accustomed to these RICO charges coming against the mafia, coming against the Bloods or the Crips or big criminal enterprises and organizations. And what essentially the government is trying to do here is note that, R. Kelly's pervasive ways over the years, for lack of a better way to put it, were not just something that were singularly a part of him, but an overarching enterprise, right? That he was bringing these girls in, not just by virtue of him, but by his bodyguards, by his managers, using others, right? Within the context of this conspiracy and this, enterprise to ultimately bring these girls to him is what gave them the means by which to try this very unique prosecution that, yes, we're not generally accustomed to seeing, when what those who have been following R. Kelly over the years have just believed to be just his thing with women and young women at times, right? But it's not just his thing at this point. The government is bringing this as an organizational criminal enterprise with R. Kelly at the top.
Don't go away. We'll be right back. Nina, in terms of R. Kelly, because people, depending upon their generation, depending upon whether, what stage of their life they were at when he was just dominating the airwaves, even the hip hop airwaves, how big a star is R. Kelly, or was R. Kelly, in terms of his impact and the hits and all? Give us a sense of that.
I mean, to put it simply, R. Kelly was an R&B god. I don't know how else to say it. I think that is the most blunt way to put it. Even, we at Billboard named him the most successful R&B artist between 1985 and 2010, based off of the R&B and hip hop charts. Like, he killed the charts as an artist. Even after the early allegations, you had allegations in the early 2000s, and even as that sort of started to unfold, he still was racking in the numbers. Like, he had Step in the Name of Love, he had Ignition, he had Hotel with Cassidy, I'm a Flirt with Bow Wow, like all these hits that came afterwards. He was going on major tours alongside other really big artists, and even up until recently, he had some collaborations in the last decade with Ty Dolla $ign, Kelly Rowland, even Lady Gaga, Bieber. And then if you want to get into him, which I won't, but if you want to get into him on the songwriting and sampling side, like, that's a whole nother conversation.
But he's making money off that side too, right? Still?
Oh yeah. I mean, he's still making his royalties are still rolling in. Whether he's actually getting access to them is another question, right? But the money is still coming in. But you didn't really see people collectively turn against him until the 2019 documentary. And that sort of forced people to sort of look at what was going on in a major way, and it brought the public in. But before that, I mean, even if in the industry people were aware, because they likely were, nobody was really letting it stop them from working with him. So he was going for a while.
Phil, what about the what about this this groupie defense that his attorneys, that these were basically disgruntled groupies, that they wanted to be around him, and there was a kind of a recurring theme of people that wanted to be, they were aspiring singers, or they just wanted to be aspiring, celebrities or entertainers or whatever. What about that groupie defense?
I mean, I think it's the strongest angle that the defense ultimately has in this matter. Now, whether or not it, pans out to be effective, time will tell, probably sooner than later. But nevertheless, for the purposes of the case, that essentially has to be the defense that, there's no organization here. There's no enterprise with, R. Kelly at the top, being kind of this quasi businessman that's, in the business of, bringing in women for these sexually debaucherous acts. That's not what's going on here. It's just essentially R. Kelly is like what he was just described to be. From his 1993 to about 2007, his run was legendary, right? In the R&B world, in the music world, in the hip hop world. And to that end, he had fans, right? And to that end, he had women chasing after him. And to the extent that ultimately he had relations with those women, it doesn't turn those relationships, no matter what may have occurred throughout the process of them, into some criminal enterprise, right? As much as it was just him dealing with women that ultimately, when things didn't pan out, either with their careers, right, or with whatever they ultimately wanted from him, now all of a sudden they're coming and saying, well, hey, it's not just that, we had a relationship, he forced me into it, right? And, playing into like the underlying allegations of the indictment is ultimately what the defense is saying that a lot of these witnesses are doing, but that in reality, those things never really happened. These were just individual one-off relationships that just didn't go anywhere. Those people were resentful and mad about it. And here we are at trial, right? Like, as a defense attorney, it would be malpractice to not go there. But again, I just don't know how effective ultimately it's going to pan out this time, right? As opposed to maybe that 2008 trial, when it's not federal, when you're only dealing with, a couple of witnesses, right? They can be, potentially paid off or what have you. You can't do that in federal court. And so we'll see how it plays out, Lisa.
Charles, in terms of the age, because we, in different states, there's different ages for what's considered an adult, what's considered a minor. Some of these accusers were 17 when they first encountered R. Kelly. Does that matter in terms of the federal law?
Right. Well, the federal statutes give different guidelines as to when the statute would run on a particular charge. But, to Philip's point, what's interesting here from the prosecution standpoint is that, they could label them, groupies, what have you. They're victims on the government side, right? These women were preyed upon, and from the racketeering and conspiracy of it all, it's part of his plan, the overall scheme of things. And, when he talks about when you look at the medical implications, the long-term effects for these victims, right? Several of them, that's not a groupie. When someone is medically tainted as a result of sexual contact, that's not a groupie. That someone needs to be held accountable.
That's a victim, and psychologically too.
Correct. So and that, I think, is something that I would like to see, play itself out a little more.
I would call it sounds like an estate, basically, where you go in before you would get onto the actual property. At the security gate, you had to sign an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, that you wouldn't take pictures or wouldn't talk about whatever was going on. I don't know what exactly was in it. And then you'd have to produce a driver's license or government ID. And if you didn't have one, they would take a Polaroid, a picture of you right there. What do you make of those kind of precautions?
I mean, as it comes across in the trial, that's the one area where, when you're trying to go that this is a one-off type of situation in terms of each individual relationship with each woman, this is a bad fact, right? If I'm R. Kelly's lawyer, only because that does kind of sound a bit organizational, right? That kind of sounds almost like policy handbook in terms of coming on to the R. Kelly criminal enterprise estate in Olympia, that ultimately you have to have your picture taken, you have to have ID. Like, these are policies and procedures that most people that just kind of have individual relationships don't have. Now, that being said, as Nina so eloquently described in the other segment, R. Kelly's not your typical person. This person is an R&B hip hop god over the course of the last 15 years. People at that level of the entertainment industry always have to worry about lawsuits. They always have to worry about, sometimes, and Charles will speak to this.
Takedowns, right?
Yes, they have to worry about wrongful lawsuits at times, right? And to the extent that you want to protect yourself from liability, particularly on the civil end and on the criminal end, it's not uncommon for, entertainers to have those types of NDAs, right? So it kind of cuts both ways, but definitely I think with the inherent allegations that we've been hearing all around just that allegation, it does make it a little tougher for R. Kelly to argue that this wasn't organizational in nature when, at the end of the day, you have policies and procedures to come on, to your property. You got to fight back against that.
Right, and then that presents a different thing. But Charles, in terms of a lot of the big entertainers, there's some very famous hip hop stars now with bodyguards that after the show, they're at the hotel. The bodyguard is outside the hotel room door. Any woman that comes in, they ask for their ID because they want to make sure they're not underage. Take a picture of it. Take a little video on their phone of the woman saying, "My name is such and such. I am, X number of years old, and I'm coming into this room willingly to, see, X, Y, and Z." That's very common.
I've witnessed it, Lisa. I can't disclose where I was to witness it. It does go down. What's interesting, though, and I think to Philip's point, is the whole nature of it in this setting. As the prosecution sets it up, this is not just a person trying to, kind of look out or defend himself. No, this is a person that makes it part of their practice, right? It's standard MO, and this is what's going on here. It's an enterprise. It's set up to ensnare women, and these documents are now a weapon that is being used against them to bring them in and being able to then become victimized at the hands of R. Kelly. But in this instance, when again, it's done in a systematic way and it's repetitive, and then you have the need to do it so I guess silently in some instances, I think it becomes chilling, and you don't want to think that a piece of paper is going to be used to insulate him from these, heinous acts.
Definitely. Nina, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I will say, as somebody who's navigated the music industry as both a music writer and as an artist myself, like, this was the least weird thing to me out of everything I heard. I was like, okay, like, you maybe go sign NDAs, like, whatever, like, that to me felt like the most normal thing because, like, even I was at an event recently for somebody, and at that event, like, some person was like taking little selfie videos, and you could see said celebrity in the background. The security guard snatched that phone right out of that person's hand, deleted the pictures, went to the deleted folder, wiped that out, and handed their phone back to them. Like, they don't play games. So to me, that was the part where I was like, all right, like, that can be explained away a little bit.
Nina, what about what was the most surprising thing, or some of the most surprising things you found out or heard in court?
I mean, I kind of touched on this earlier about just the testimony that was given. That was sort of surprising to me. But one thing that I will say that's been interesting that didn't happen in the courtroom but happened in the courthouse is just the magnitude of support he's receiving. There was, one supporter fan said that she took off a month of work to come every day in the morning and watch this trial. Like, and the security guards, told me, they're like, we're only letting in 8 people, like 8 members of the public. And so these people come and show up at like 6, 7 in the morning, right. Court starts at 9:30 because they want to get inside. And, there was even one woman who was, the first day they had everybody standing in line to get in. It was like the reporters mixed in with like supporters, mixed in with juror, like pretend people who thought they were, like, it was crazy. And so this one woman, they were like, oh, are you a juror? And she said, yes. And then literally at the end of the day, she was in front of a dozen reporters defending Kelly. And it turned out that it was like one of his fans who was trying to get inside. Yeah, it's that to me. And it's almost all women. So that to me is the thing that's been the most shocking that I'm trying to wrap my mind around. And like, not only are they in the courtroom, but they are in my Twitter mentions, tweeting at me, DMing me, sending me conspiracy theory videos. Like, that really has been what's been the most like, oh my God.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Street Soldiers on R.Kelly. You can watch it again and share it on our Fox 5 NY YouTube page. Remember, use your mind. It's your best weapon. I'm Lisa Evers. Let's push for peace, love, and justice for all.